Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. Thank you for joining us. The September jobs numbers were below expectations for the second month in a row as COVID continues to slow the growth of the U.S. economy. According to the Labor Department, the country added 194,000 jobs last month. That is fewer than half of the 490,000 economists had predicted. The unemployment rate did fall below 5%, driven by some people finding jobs and others giving up on looking for work, removing them from the count. It is the slowest pace of hiring so far this year. Overall, the U.S. has 4.5 million fewer jobs than at the start of the pandemic. President Biden praised the drop in the unemployment rate and used the news to make the case for his public investment plans.
Right now, things in Washington, as you all know, are awfully noisy. Turn on the news and every conversation is a confrontation. Every disagreement is a crisis. But when you take a step back and look at what's happening, we're actually making real progress. These bills are about competitiveness versus complacency. Competitiveness versus complacency. Opportunity versus decay. They're about leading the world, or whether we're going to let the world pass us by.
So for more on all of this, I want to bring in Joel Payne and Libby Cantrill. Joel is a CBS News political contributor and a Democratic strategist. Libby is the head of policy at the investment management company PIMCO. Welcome to you both. Libby, let me start with you. So far, almost 80% of the jobs lost during the pandemic have been recovered, but clearly this was a disappointing jobs report. Still, not all of the numbers were bad, and we just heard the president point out that wages are up. So where do we stand at this point?
Yeah, well, good afternoon. I mean, yes, I think that is right. I think it's also important not to extrapolate too much from one jobs report. Jobs reports are notoriously noisy and oftentimes are revised. In the case of the last 2 months, were actually revised upward. So again, you don't want to put too much emphasis on just one report. But if you kind of triangulate today's disappointing job report with the consumer confidence of the last few weeks, what you see is that Delta continues to provide a headwind to this recovery, and it's for sure an economic recovery, but it is going to be punctuated by these sort of obstacles again that are being presented by the Delta variant. So it is, there were some bright spots in the jobs report today. Again, overall disappointing, however, but it just sort of underscores that this is a fragile recovery. One thing, though, I think is important from a policymaker perspective, and you saw the president sort of emphasize this, is that this is a great talking point in some ways for Democrats who want to see their Build Back Better agenda get through Congress. Because what we saw today with the jobs report, labor force participation, especially among women, continued to decline. And that is a good talking point for folks who want to see things like the child tax credit get extended or the child care tax provision. So again, it's going to be, I think, an opportunity for some members of Congress to actually use this jobs report to their benefit in terms of advancing that agenda.
Right. And Joel, so to follow up on Libby's point there, if you're the Biden administration, how do you use all of this to bolster the argument for putting more money into public investment? I mean, we did hear the president, tout all of the ways that his Build Back Better plan, his infrastructure and social spending bills would, number one, create more child care. Number two, create more and better public education. And he made the argument that all of this is needed to work in tandem if we want the economy to fully recover. So, to Libby's point, does all of this bolster the Democrats' argument as they try to get these bills through Congress?
Well, Tanya, Libby's first point, I think, is an instructive one, which is you really want to stay away from overreacting to one jobs report over another. These things, there are a lot of factors that go into them. There are a lot of factors that go into the predictions, and there are a lot of factors that go into the actual end result. I think specific to the president's agenda, and the point that you're making, Tanya, in your question, Democrats are going to make an argument for large-scale investment. They're going to say this jobs report that was disappointing is actually a rationale for why you should invest more, particularly in the middle class, where a lot of the relief is targeted in the Build Back Better agenda. What the president's opponents will say is, we're also concerned about inflation. And some people will point to inflation and will point to, kind of more conservative economic arguments as a rationale to not invest as much. I think that is the chief tipping point in Washington, D.C. right now.
So, Libby, as you know, Congress is putting off an impending debt limit deadline until December. Hopefully, it'll buy more time to pass the infrastructure and social spending plans. But, your view is that both of these bills will be passed. Is that correct, in some form by the year's end? Why do you believe that?
Yeah, that is correct. Now that they've at least postponed the debt ceiling debate just for another day. Of course, we all know Washington, they're very good at kind of kicking the can down the road on both sides of the aisle. And as you said, it does give them more, ranged in terms of addressing both the BIF, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but then also this Build Back Better agenda. But you're right. I mean, our view has been for some time that frankly, failure is just not an option for Democrats. They simply have to pass both of these bills. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, if you remember, has already passed the Senate, so just needs to pass the House in order for it to be signed into law. And then the reconciliation bill, this Build Back Better agenda that Democrats are going to go on their own. They kind of have to pass this because they are going into 2022 in a sort of what it looks like it's going to be a pretty vulnerable midterm cycle for them. And this includes so many of the things that, despite a lot of the intra-party consternation, most Democrats agree on in terms of providing support for the middle class, like Joel just said, providing support for women in particular who need to get back into the labor force. So again, I don't think failure is an option. I think a lot of this is just sort of part and parcel to legislating in Washington. It's very noisy. They're doing it out in the press, which is a little bit unusual, or maybe anathema to public viewers. But I think the point here is that failure is not an option, and that they will pass these two things ultimately because, again, they kind of have to going into the midterm election cycle.
So, Joel, once again, following up on Libby's point, where do you think Democrats are willing to give some space to get the president's agenda passed? Yesterday, I spoke to Representative Jayapal, and she suggested that Democrats were not willing to give up any of the social programs, or at least the Democrats in her coalition, in her progressive coalition, were not willing to give up any social programs, but were willing to perhaps negotiate the length in which those programs would be funded. However, we have heard that the White House pretty much wants whatever is going to get funded to be funded for a longer time, so is maybe looking at actually cutting some programs. So where do you think this negotiation is going to end up among the Democrats?
Well, this is where the number crunchers take front and center, right? And you've got a lot of smart people on those congressional committees that know where to find the money to pay for some of these proposals that are very ambitious by progressives. There's reporting in Politico in recent days about progressives understanding that they are going to have to give a little bit on this package. And the place where they'll probably give is on how much they will lean into that idea of taxing the wealthy more fairly. You've got folks like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema that want to temper some of those expectations around how much you can get that corporate tax rate back up to pre-Trump tax cut levels, and also the capital gains tax. You're talking about billions of dollars related to what percentage point they land on. Is it 300 billion or 500 billion in revenue you can raise? So those are the kinds of questions that I think a lot of Democrats are going to be having over the next few days, weeks, and months as they decide how do they get to yes on this? How do you get 50 people in that Senate Democratic caucus to yes? And how do you get all of those Democrats in that increasingly diverse House Democratic caucus to a yes?
Well, we're still not there yet. Negotiations continue. Joel Payne and Libby Cantrill, thanks to both of you for joining us. We really appreciate it.